Thank you very much, and thank you, Adam, for choosing Rock of Ages as one of our hymns this morning. That was a pleasant surprise. Oh, thank you, Nixon, I guess. Right. Can everybody hear me? The mic's... Is that a little better? Okay. Well, I'd also, the title of my talk is a takeoff on my book, A Born-Again Episcopalian, Rediscovering Charles Pettit Mcllvaine. I would also like to thank St. Stephen's Church and the Secker Society and the Diocese of Albany for all the work that went into this, putting together this conference, and for inviting me to share with you an overview of the life of Charles Mcllvaine, who was Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio from 1832 to 1873, 41 years. And I'll offer a few remarks regarding my book and a few words on its relevance for today. I'd like to start with a personal reminiscence. When I was in search of some especially hard to find documents on the bishop, while writing the book, I visited, among a number of other places, the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan, a great place to visit for unusual scholarly material. And after filling out a detailed form explaining my project, providing the working title of my book, and promising to be a model citizen while in the library, very fussy about these aged documents, I was escorted to a table on which I could put my books and personal papers, letters, newspapers, and other materials that I was looking for. Once having been provided with these items, I was busy taking notes when a staff member, and I later found out he was the reading room supervisor, kind of crept up to my table, and he had read my application to enter the library, in which I put the working title of my book. He was kind of a crusty fellow, rather blunt in his manner of speaking and making sure all his scholars were obeying the rules. I feared I might have done something wrong, and to my relief, that was not the case. He was intrigued, it turned out, by the title of my book. "You call your book A Born-Again Episcopalian," he said, sort of gruffly. "Yes," I replied. "Well," he continued, "I've never heard of such a thing. Never heard of a born-again Episcopalian, and I've been an Episcopalian for over 40 years, and I've never heard of such a thing." So having stated this view, he walked away to attend to other duties, and as he did so, I was reassured in my choice of a title, a born-again Episcopalian, that it would be an attention-getter. The reading room supervisor, it seems, is no exception to the rule, as I'm sure we all know. In Michigan, where my wife and I come from, the notion of the born-again, that is, the Evangelical Episcopalian, is virtually unheard of. Despite a modest reappearance of this form of churchmanship extending over several decades, the two words evangelical and Episcopalian appear to many to be quite incompatible. There are areas where this is not so much the case, I think, parts of the South, the Southwest, some in Texas, Pennsylvania, New York to some extent, right in this diocese. So there are scattered pockets here and there, yet lack of awareness persists, despite the fact that evangelicalism has shown signs of life in the Episcopal Church during the past 40 to 50 years. And despite the fact that in the middle years of the 19th century, it was a powerful presence within the church, controlling approximately a third of all the parishes, and a near majority in the House of Bishops. Moreover, many of its bishops were men of a very high caliber, and none more so, of course, than our subject today, Charles Mcllvaine, who was bishop, scholar, revivalist, educator, traveler, Anglophile, diplomat, and leader of the Evangelical party within the Episcopal Church. So it is of this man that I have written. From the time I first discovered Bishop Mcllvaine, I have found his life and mission worthy of the greatest admiration. So in view of this, I'll share a few reflections about him, consider some of his many achievements, ponder his relevance for today, and generally pay tribute to the good impulse he put into the world. Let me begin by observing that Charles Mcllvaine, despite his 41 years as Bishop of Ohio, was not born in that state, nor did he live there until he was past 30 years of age. He was an Easterner, a patrician, a man with a privileged background who used that background, that privileged background and its advantages to open doors for the gospel. He was born and raised in Burlington, New Jersey, where his father was one of the most prominent lawyers in the state. His parents had a busy social life in Burlington, where they raised young Charles and his brothers and sisters. Neither parent appeared to be particularly religious. In fact, they were somewhat nominal Episcopalians. Charles loved and respected both of his parents, even as they showered much love on him and his siblings and modeled rectitude and honor in the larger community. Though a good boy and a good student, Charles was not particularly religious himself during his early years. Christian faith became a reality to him only at the age of 16, when he was converted at a revival at the College of New Jersey at Princeton, which we know today, of course, is Princeton University, where he was a student at the time. The college was indeed ripe for revival. Students at this elite school were, it appears, not only in need of spiritual renewal or rebirth. Some of their number, it seems, were in need of instruction in basic civilized behavior. If you think today's young people are disturbing, consider this. I'll read a passage from the book. Let's see, 59. Indeed, the students were ripe for repentance, as indicated by contemporary records. Moreover, the offenses of some had gone far beyond breaches of piety. In January 1814, for instance, a year before the revival, students had both burned the college privy and exploded the, quote, big cracker, a hollow log filled with 2 pounds of gunpowder, against a doorway at Nassau Hall. The blast blew away the door, cracked masonry, and shattered glass. And in January 1817, on the other side of the revival, excuse me, I'm losing my place here. On the other side of the revival, a riot erupted when students, angry over the length of their reading assignments, sealed the entrances to Nassau Hall and the rooms of tutors and theology students. Attempts to punish the rioters sparked additional violence in which pistols, clubs, and knives were wielded. The president of the college was struck by a chunk of ice, and the pulpit from which he preached was partially destroyed. The revival of 1815 appears to have been an island of peace in a sea of discontent. Other riots had occurred as well, among them the Great Rebellion, it was called, of 1807. After each disturbance, troublemakers were expelled from the school, sometimes by the dozens. So one wonders if such students ever were likely candidates for religious conversion in the first place. but if they were not, others most certainly were. Many conversions were recorded at the revival of 1815, among them, of course, the conversion of Charles Mcllvaine. Also converted at that time was Charles Hodge, who would go on to become a titan of theology at Princeton College and the voice of conservative Presbyterianism throughout much of the century. Despite their denominational differences, he and Mcllvaine remained affectionate friends for the rest of their lives. As for Mcllvaine, he had this to say of his spiritual rebirth. It was powerful and prevailing and fruitful in the conversion of young men to God. And it was quiet, unexcited, and entirely free from all devices or means beyond the few and simple which God has appointed, namely prayer and the ministry of the Word. This was a vital point to Mcllvaine the Episcopalian, that devices and means, by which he referred to the engineered, quote, revivals of Charles G. Finney and others, were in no way necessary. Mcllvaine continues, "In that precious season of the power of God, my religious life began. I had heard before. I began then to know. I must doubt the deepest convictions of my soul when I doubt whether that revival was the work of the Spirit of God. Many that labored faithfully in the ministry and are now at rest with the Lord, some that are still in the work, many whose mark has been strongly made on their generation on the side of the gospel, were the subjects of that work." So of that revival at Princeton Seminary. In the years ahead, Mcllvaine would complete his undergraduate studies and also at Princeton his seminary education. At the time, the Episcopal Church had no seminary of its own, hence its clergy had to be trained by the schools of other denominations, although they were allowed to follow a special Episcopal course of study, as well as participating in more general courses designed for all seminarians. Following graduation, Mcllvaine married a childhood friend, Emily Cox. They would, in the years ahead, raise a large family, and he began early to make his mark on the church. His earliest achievement involved the Sunday school movement, then in its infancy in America. As a pioneer of the movement, he established a highly successful Sunday school in his home parish in Burlington, and this while he was barely out of seminary and not even ordained. As we shall see, such initiative betokened his lifelong ability to become a leader in whatever aspect of church life he engaged. Mcllvaine's first parish in 1820 was Christ Church, Georgetown, and it was there, in front of prominent parishioners in the nation's capital, that he began to hone his skills as priest and preacher. While in Georgetown, he was also elected twice to serve as chaplain of the United States Senate. He became involved, too, with the Washington Theological Repertory, a journal promoting the evangelical cause in the Episcopal Church. Owing to his connection with the Repertory, he began to make serious friends and allies in the broader church, as well as enemies. Though well-liked by his congregation, after several years, Mcllvaine decided to move on. He got the opportunity while, quote, taking tea one day with no less a personage than John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War and later Vice President of the United States, who was then involved in reforming the curriculum at West Point Military Academy. The result was the appointment of Mcllvaine in 1825 as West Point chaplain, a position he would fill with his usual zeal and effectiveness, despite a disappointing first year. While at West Point, he interacted with a number of young men who would in time leave a mark on history, among them Robert E. Lee, Leonidas Polk, later known as the Fighting Bishop, Robert Anderson, commander of Fort Sumter at the start of the Civil War, and Jefferson Davis, later, of course, the President of the Confederate States of America. It seems that wherever Mcllvaine went, something of significance happened. At West Point, it came in the form of a religious revival. In that hard-headed school of tactics and weaponry and engineering, the chaplain found himself as the point man of a full-fledged revival, with numerous conversions and lives committed to Christian faith and service. Yet all were not happy with what Mcllvaine had wrought. He was not only a successful change agent, but a lightning rod for criticism from those of a different turn of mind. Okay, I have a little passage on this period about the revival at West Point. Though done, quote, done decently and in order, the West Point revival, and by extension its leader, Mcllvaine, stirred controversy beyond the academy. Mcllvaine was informed in a letter from his friend and fellow evangelical, James Milner, that, quote, enemies of truth were accusing him of turning West Point, quote, into a theological seminary and aiming to make young men soldiers in the church militant. The New England Galaxy, for instance, lamented the presence of, quote, revival in the very sanctuary of algebraic symbols and curves, redoubts and bastions, gunpowder and projectiles. Who has dared to introduce the demon of fanaticism among the flower of a free country's chivalry? Mrs. Anne Royal of Newport registered dismay following a visit. Quote, a better lesson on the danger of priests, to say nothing of sects, was never exhibited than this of West Point. It shows them in their true colors, end quote. Rumblings were heard also from the Diocese of New York, the locus of high church agitation. High churchmen considered revivals disorderly, irrational, and unbiblical by definition, and the one at West Point to be no exception. They were especially unwilling to remain quiet about a revival under the auspices of a fellow churchman. Even Mcllvaine expressed concern. Some aberrations had occurred, he conceded, and some of the charges leveled in New York were based in fact. Further, a visiting committee from the government had been unfavorably impressed with the happenings and made its displeasure known. They did not report this dissatisfaction in their formal report, notes historian Diana Butler, but pressured Mcllvaine through informal channels to find a new position. Owing to the revival and its purported excesses, the chaplain eventually lost his position at the academy. So in a word, things got a little hot for Mcllvaine at West Point, despite the friendship and support of the academy superintendent. So he moved on again, this time to become rector of St. Anne's Church in Brooklyn, New York. While serving there, he also became a part-time professor of the Evidence for Revealed Religion at the University of the City of New York. While rector of St. Anne's, he was well-liked and, as usual, effective in his work. Not surprisingly, he was active in reforming the Sunday school, turning a mediocre program into a thriving one. In 1832, Mcllvaine got the opportunity to enter the episcopate. After much prayer and reflection, he accepted the position of Bishop of Ohio, and the polished Easterner headed west. He was the second bishop of the diocese and the second president of Kenyon College and Seminary in Gambier, succeeding the intriguingly named Philander Chase in both positions. For the next 4 decades, he served as bishop until his death at the age of 74 while traveling in Italy. Over those years, his accomplishments were many. The diocese grew dramatically. from 40 parishes and 900 members when he arrived to 116 parishes and 15,000 members. In the years before the railroad came in, Mcllvaine traveled by horseback or at the reins of a buggy to visit his far-flung parishes, and neither rain or wind, snow or sleet could stop him. Here is an example of the hardships this frontier bishop encountered even after the railroad had been extended into Ohio. Mcllvaine further told Carus, that refers to William Carus, who was one of his English friends, in a letter of 1854 about a singular incident in which he managed to find a bit of humor in spite of the discomforts he had endured. It seems the train had set him down some 7 miles from a small Welsh origin parish where he had scheduled a visit. He had expected to be met by, quote, some conveyance dispatched to take him from the station to the parish. Owing to a misunderstanding, however, this was not to be, nor could he find a horse for hire in the village. So, he wrote, I shouldered my baggage, which was not light, and overcoat. The day was hot and the road very rough and hilly, and trudged on the 7 miles, occasionally sitting on a log and taking a book to read, till I had rested my arms from their load. By and by he entered the village, quote, to the consternation of the Welsh pastor and his wife. The only ill effect of this misadventure, he wrote, was a severe cold and cough, which lingered even as he was writing to Carus. Such is our dignity sometimes in Ohio, he reflected. I could mention other incidents describing the rigors and dangers faced by Mcllvaine, including a near-fatal accident involving the buggy he was driving and an oncoming train, and a near-fatal steam ferry accident on the Ohio River, in which the bishop acquitted himself heroically and humanely. But these would take us too far afield. Such incidents and others are described in detail in the book. Over the course of his career, Mcllvaine traveled to England more than 6 times, including participating as a delegate to the First Lambeth Conference in 1867, where, predictably, despite increasing age and declining health, he played an active role in the proceedings. Earlier, he had traveled to England at the beginning of the Civil War at the behest of President Lincoln and his cabinet to help persuade the British to not recognize the Confederate States diplomatically. His many acquaintances in England, in both church and state, gave him a sympathetic hearing on this matter, for he was very popular in that country. Speaking of President Lincoln, Mcllvaine maintained a cordial friendship with the president and seems to have visited him at least a handful of times. Thus, he was able to add a number of personal observations of the president to the great store of Lincolnia that exists. He also preached and prayed over Lincoln's casket in Cleveland as the president's funeral train stopped during its return to Springfield, Illinois in 1865. Also during the Civil War, Mcllvaine volunteered for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was a forerunner of the Red Cross, intending to the needs of wounded soldiers and in providing spiritual services and comfort to the troops at large, both Union and Confederate. He knew personally and visited Union Generals McClellan, Hooker, Grant, and others, not to mention continuation of his old friendship with Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, who was an Ohioan. Interestingly, Salmon Chase was a nephew of Philander Chase, Mcllvaine's predecessor as bishop, and Salmon had even lived with his uncle for several years while in his early teens. Over the course of his long career, Mcllvaine led a number of successful religious revivals and assisted others on several more. He always conducted revivals decently and in order. You see, he was, of course, a good Episcopalian. He opposed the revival methods of his famous contemporary, Charles Finney, whose engineered revivals were calculated to stir up emotional outbursts. Mcllvaine, who outlined his views in a letter on the proper way to conduct a revival, considered the deliberate excitement of animal feelings at any point in the process unseemly and unnecessary. Nonetheless, historians report there were occasional outbursts of emotion even among Episcopalians with, quote, violent shrieks of agony and obstreperous shouts of joy, not unheard of. Although Mcllvaine's career was a remarkably productive and successful one, it came at a high cost to him, for all that he did was done against the backdrop of chronic health problems, which laid him low from time to time, prompting his periodic trips to England for rest and recuperation. He also wrestled with personal spiritual challenges on a regular basis, recording them in his journals, thus leaving us a detailed and heartfelt record of a good and accomplished man who recognized that he too was a sinner, as much in need of repentance and rescue as the folk to whom he ministered. In spite of Mcllvaine's day-to-day labors as a bishop and his ever-active interior life of the Spirit, he also found time to publish 70 works of various lengths, from learned treatises to practical pamphlets. I mentioned just 3 of them. First, Evidences of Christianity, which was based on lectures he gave at the City University of New York early in his career. It is, in my view, a magnificent apologetic, graceful, persuasive. It is aged well. In fact, I don't recall reading anything in it that does not appear to be self-evidently true from a biblical and historical point of view, even though mainline theology has, of course, wandered in a variety of other directions since its long ago publication. One could say its well-documented assertions and careful handling of evidence have not been proved wrong, only abandoned. Secondly, his magnum opus is a massive critique of the Catholic-oriented Oxford or Tractarian movement, lengthily entitled Oxford Divinity, compared with that of the Romish and Anglican churches, with a special view of the doctrine of justification by faith. This work established his high reputation throughout the evangelical world, both here and overseas. Although it engaged specific issues of the day, it also stands as an enduring treatment of the basic differences between Protestant and Catholic views of the faith. Thirdly, his short work, Rationalism, written in the form of a letter, was an eloquent critique of the emerging broad church influence within the Anglican Church, written in awareness that the American church would in turn be a target of this influence. That increasingly militant movement, inspired by German higher criticism and other non-traditional sources, was at the time in America a cloud no bigger than a man's hand. But Mcllvaine was an astute man, and he raised the alarm. He could see the end of an argument or of a movement in its beginnings, and he saw where the broad church, circa 1860, was headed with its naturalism, skeptical view of miracles, and general biblical revisionism. He could tell that it would lead, or he could tell where it would lead given time and how it would spread its teachings in the decades ahead. Thus, he joined high churchmen, who he was at odds with at many points. He joined with them, as well as his fellow low churchmen, to prepare for the onslaught. And for a time, these traditional parties held firm in curbing the influence of the new teachings. By the end of the 19th century, however, the broad church, alongside a greatly diminished low church and a high church absorbed into ritualism and Anglo-Catholicism, had largely succeeded in shaping the basic contours of the Episcopal Church as it exists today and in recent decades. Each of Mcllvaine's 3 works just cited, along with his other studies and treatises, not to mention his multitude of sermons, were written in a fluent, polished style, clear, detailed, accurate, with a content or subject matter he had learned, marked, and inwardly digested before it ever hit the page. It is theology at its most impressive and most readable. So where are we today? As intimated earlier, there has been a modest evangelical revival in the Episcopal Church over the past 40 or 50 years, though it now appears to be on hold. Beginning in the early 1960s, Evangelical Episcopalianism, in something like its classical form, began to reappear on the scene. Evangelical and charismatic renewal activities proliferated, even as the Episcopal Church began to decline dramatically in membership. Owing to their passion to evangelize and renew, evangelicals and charismatics, give them credit, blunted the decline to some extent by bringing new members into the fold. Yet despite such usefulness, the revival did not please all Episcopalians. There is an attempt, church historian Urban T. Holmes warned, quote, to bring to this country a brand of English evangelicalism which has never really found much acceptance here before, end quote. The remark likely represented wishful thinking on the part of a prominent church liberal. It is true that such British churchmen as John Stott and J.I. Packer, as well as the British-born charismatic Dennis Bennett, were influential in kindling evangelical interest. But to say that such a brand of churchmanship had never found much acceptance here is simply incorrect. As we have seen, the Evangelical Party, led by Bishop Mcllvaine, was an undeniable success in the antebellum period. Moreover, and I might add, up until the turn of the century, around 1900, by that time, it had largely petered out. There remained a low church presence, but that classic evangelical fire, I think, was largely absent by the turn of the 20th century. Moreover, the more recent revival of evangelicalism is not simply a British import any more than its more recent successor. Bishop Mcllvaine, though admittedly an Anglophile, was a proud and patriotic American representing the best qualities of his nation. And the movement he led represented not a British misfit, but a robust form of Anglican and Episcopalian evangelical doctrine and practice with indigenous as well as, of course, British roots, flourishing for many decades on American soil. I believe Bishop Mcllvaine stands as an exemplar to this day. His critique of the broad church movement, as that movement surfaced in 1860, over 150 years ago, is clearly relevant to our situation, for one can see the offshoots of the rationalist plant as they continue to bud and blossom in forms that appear new but are really old. The techniques used in the dissolution of Scripture in the 1860s have, in the course of time, led logically and inevitably to everything from the blessing of same-sex unions to the Jesus Seminar, with various stops along the way. Mcllvaine had their number. His critique remains useful. Could he have remained in the Episcopal Church as it is today? One can assume with confidence that open homosexuality in the church would have been quite beyond the imagination of a Victorian clergyman. Likewise, other revisionist trends and tendencies in the church, downplaying or denying the deity of Jesus, denial of his bodily resurrection, denial of his unique role in salvation, would have been unthinkable to Mcllvaine. However, one development he would have welcomed and affirmed is the reappearance, as we have noted here and there, of evangelical tendencies in the church, with their emphases on the necessity of conversion, the importance of vicarious atonement, the inspiration of Scripture, and an emotional but tasteful spirituality. Of course, such evangelicalism is at present holding on for dear life. Many evangelicals have left the Episcopal Church. Sometimes the overall picture appears bleak. Yet inside the church, a remnant of the faithful always remains to keep the flame burning. Whatever Mcllvaine's specific advice on specific issues might be for us today, it would certainly be grounded in a high view of Scripture, warm spirituality, sound and well-defined theology, adherence to an informed conscience, and the courage of one's convictions. Such attributes are ever in season, and Bishop Mcllvaine had them all. Thank you. Guess it's question time. Philip?
You mentioned his book of evidences.
Yes.
And I think you said that it's still as convincing reading today as it was in his time. I'm just wondering if it's still in print.
Well, I have a print copy of it, but it requires kind of a roundabout route to get there. To its credit, the University of Michigan came through with that for me. Apparently, they have computerized just immense amounts of books from years past, and I discovered I could order that book, which I did. Apparently, it's a print-on-demand sort of thing. They get an order. I'm sure they can't have had very many orders of that book, but I did so, and it came, and it's obviously the old typeset and everything, but very readable and just very impressive. He actually, the material in it was begun while he was at West Point, because I'm not sure if I said here, but he was not only chaplain there, he also taught ethics and I forget, there was one or two other subjects he had to teach. But he began preparing those lectures there, and then when he went to his parish in Brooklyn, he was given this opportunity to teach on the side at the City University of New York, which was very new at the time, and they became a full-fledged series of lectures, and that is what is organized into that book. It's about 400 pages long, and here he was, barely 30 years old, and he had done this work. I recommend it. Like I say, I had to go through the University of Michigan to get it, and it was apparently a print on demand, but I got it and used it, and it's excellent. I recommend it. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, how did the corpus of his work end up there? Since the bishop doesn't.
Oh, well, it didn't. The bulk of his archives are in Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. Yeah, and also he shares a lower level room with Philander Chase, who was his predecessor as bishop. Both of their papers are there. And of course, all these books are in print there, but you can't take them. Just go there and take notes. Yes, this little library in Michigan is a research library at the University of Michigan. Of course, they've got vast general libraries, but this is a little off-brand sort of place. And I found a number of old newspaper articles mentioning Mcllvaine and his struggles with well, I don't want to go into too much information on this, but he, as I mentioned, he did make enemies in the church, or people picked fights with him, let's put it either way. There was a pair of brothers, the Onderdonks, who were each bishops, one in New York and one in Pennsylvania, and they had it in for Mcllvaine from the beginning. They were very high church, and they considered him and his associates in the evangelical movement. They were very unsympathetic. And so there was a constant struggle, high church, low church, as we all know. But those two men, the Onderdonks, it all came to a head in the first one was 1844, and their first names don't come to me. But one ended up being defrocked for alcoholism. He had there was a lot of erratic behavior going on in his case. He had been, supposedly because of physical ailments, a doctor had recommended he drink brandy, which he took it up with some gusto, and it got the better of him, and he was defrocked. And a year or so later, his brother, who was the Bishop of New York, the second Onderdonk, was defrocked at a church convention. Of course, there's lots of, the evangelicals got together. But I mean, there was no question of the evidence. And his brother, I think, had a bit of an alcohol problem, but he had more of a problem with women, including some clergy wives, what we would call a fanny pincher today, and sometimes even worse. It's very embarrassing, and it's the only R-rated material in the book, so get it for that, if nothing else. Because this trial, to push him out of the church was well documented. It was in all the papers. Talk about embarrassing Episcopal headlines. And he lost his case. And it was interesting how it was argued at first. Oh, it's totally bogus. None of this happened. Well, then it happened. Well, here's how it happened. And his defenders just would move from one position to another. And finally, well, it's kind of old news. It happened a long time ago. Well, it really didn't happen a long time ago. But anyway, so he was dismissed from the church. I don't know where I'm going with that, how I got started, but yes, Bruce.
Did the bishop have any relationship with Virginia Seminary?
He did, very much so. Not directly, but his friend, and I can't remember, that might have been James Milner. No, I don't think it was. I can't remember the bishop, but at this time, the House of Bishops, at least early on, was like 20 people. It wasn't a huge, number of churchmen. Of course, it grew during Mcllvaine's considerably long life for the time, especially he was 74 when he died. But he was very sympathetic to it. In fact, that was one of the problems they ran into when he was in Georgetown, because the evangelicals were trying to organize what became Virginia Seminary. At the same time, the high churchmen were establishing a general seminary in New York, and they thought, we don't need two. And of course, they wanted to control, to have the high church influence. And so they were very unhappy with these evangelicals who were trying to organize, and did organize, and establish a seminary in Virginia. So he was at least on the, around the edges on that, and supportive of it. Yes?
When he was at West Point, did he have a military rank, or was he a civilian working?
Apparently, as chaplain, he was, there's no mention of military rank, but his time there certainly stamped his life, because during the Civil War, I mentioned some of the generals, he would visit them during, well, not during battles, but, during campaigns. And so he soaked up some military life, and while he was there, and had kind of a lifelong interest in the military. There's also a mention in the book, at one point he accompanied President Lincoln in a buggy to go out and see a new artillery piece was being tested. And so just the sort of thing, he was around the edges of that too. And he was with, I mentioned Salmon Chase, who was Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury, almost said State, Secretary of Treasury. Mcllvaine happened to be in the Chase home in the aftermath of First Bull Run. Was that the first battle? Bull Run, yes. Yes, a disaster for the North. And it's very graphic scenes of they're looking out, Chase and Mcllvaine and Chase's two daughters, they're looking out the windows as the Northern Army, which got whipped, came in all the caissons and the artillery and these ambulance wagons with their black curtains come clattering down the street. So it's just kind of it really brings it home to you. And they even brought wounded federal soldiers into Chase's home, and Mcllvaine helped tend them. I mean, he wasn't a medical man, but he pitched in along with the daughters one soldier was just swearing up a storm because he was in pain, and Mcllvaine said, well, you'd get a lot, what did he say to him? You'd get farther if you'd abandon the devil's language and pray to the Lord. But the guy was suffering, so. Anyway, yes, Bishop.
What do you think Bishop Mcllvaine's message would be to the church today?
Well, I have given it some thought. I could preface my comments by the fact that right around the time he died in 1873 is when the break came and the Reformed Episcopal Church split off. And he was visited by Bishop Cummins, I can't remember if there's a G in there, who was the leader of that breakaway. And Mcllvaine was back home at this time, and he was approached by Cummins, and said to him, no, I'm too old to get involved in anything like this. And he may have even died then by the time the break came, but my sense was he was not interested in breaking away at all. So my sense is he would have stayed in the Episcopal Church. But like I say, some of these issues were just so beyond a Victorian clergyman's mind, it's hard to say. Knowing his love of Scripture and his evangelical belief in inspiration, and they didn't use some of their inerrancy. I don't know if that was used at the time, but certainly an infallible Bible. He could have gone to his Bible and said no. So you would like to think he would have been here, been one of us. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you for being here.